Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, Warpaint Off-Road. I'm Dan. Normally on this channel, I'm building some kind of weird, crazy contraption.
Oh, she's going to bed with me.
Oh, we're gonna tuck her in.
That tire identifies as a dog, so we're good.
Housekeeping! Housekeeping?
Right now I'm building this crazy CJ5, or I'm working on war paint, or I'm ton swapping something, or I'm building something kind of extreme. Air locker down in there, and a grizzly rear. Well, not today. You already know what I'm doing today because of the title of this video, so let's get to it. Today we're working on a JLU, and it also happens to be a 4xe. Now I know what a lot of you guys are thinking. Oh my God, it's rough country.
No! God, please, no!
Guys, rough country actually makes a 2.5-inch lift for a Jeep like this. That's perfect for 99% of the people out there that just want to raise their Jeep, have it look a little bit more aggressive, and drive around, pick their kids up. They're never gonna take it off-road. That owner, this is the lift kit you're gonna want. Let's talk about why. Now, the owner of this rig is just like a lot of other Jeep owners, and they don't need something on tons and 40s. They don't need trussed axles on giant 37s or 42s, right? They don't need anything super extreme.
No, don't like that.
That's because they're never actually gonna take it off-road. This owner just wants the look. They want something that's gonna sit a little bit taller, put slightly larger tires on it, and he just wants it to look the part. There's a lot of Jeep owners out there that are like that. So when he came to me and asked me which lift I recommended for it, we went with Rough Country and a nice set of Bilstein shocks. Rough Country makes a 2.5-inch lift that is essentially a spacer kit. You're still going to use your factory springs, so you're going to have that factory ride quality. You're not going to deal with some of the issues that normally accompany a Rough Country lift, right? Years ago, Rough Country didn't make the highest quality springs, and they often would sag over time. Your 2.5-inch lift would very quickly only be a 1-inch lift, and that's not what he's looking for. But with the factory ride quality of the factory spring, the durability of the factory spring, we're going to keep it. But then comes the issue of shocks. That's why this lift kit is a lot cheaper online through Rough Country, because you can order it with shocks, but the Rough Country shocks, or you can order it without. He chose to order it without. Then I recommended he go with a Bilstein 5100, a super high quality shock for a mediocre price point, and that raised the price of this overall lift to $600. $600, few hours of your time, you can do this yourself. And I'm not gonna do this lift in my garage. I wanna do this the way most people would, outside in their driveway. My driveway is slightly pitched. Anytime you install lift kit, you wanna do it on a flat level surface. So if you don't have a garage, the street is the next best thing. So if you wanna learn how to install your own Rough Country lift, you want to learn how to install something that's going to keep that factory ride quality and give your Jeep a nice aggressive stance, well, we're going to get to it. You need a jack and a couple of tall jack stands. You're also going to need a couple of sockets and a pair of pliers. I'm not sure if I'm going to use needle nose or something else, but I can always swap those out. You're going to need a 3/4-inch socket, a 9/16 socket, a 10mm, a 15mm, an 18mm, a 21mm, and then a deep well 22mm. The first thing you're going to need to do is safely chock the rear wheels and lift the front of the vehicle. With the jack safely holding up one corner of the vehicle, you're going to want to place your jack stand directly behind the lower control arm mounting bracket on the frame. Once that's done, you're going to do the same thing to the other side. With it safely jacked up and on jack stands, you're going to want to take a little pressure up off the axle again, because even though it's on jack stands, when you release that jack, it'll lower your tire down to the ground. You won't be able to remove it. So with the tire up in the air a little bit, we're gonna spin these lug nuts off with that 22 well deep socket. I'm gonna use an impact gun, but you don't have to. A socket wrench or a tire iron, as long as it's a 22 millimeter, is gonna work. This just does it a little quicker. Real quick, while we have both these different styles of tires sitting right next to each other, if you're doing this to your rig, you probably also want an aggressive looking tire. And something like an all-terrain is usually gonna be the thing that you want if you are not taking yours off-road. Mud terrain tires look super aggressive, but they don't last that long. Part of what makes them super aggressive and function off-road is the really soft rubber compound, but that makes them not live too long on the street. A tire like this Nitto Ridge Grappler, it's actually gonna be more of an all-terrain tire, so it's still more aggressive than a typical street tire, but the rubber is gonna be a lot harder. The compound is a lot tougher. They're gonna last a lot longer, still give you that little bit more of an aggressive look than jacking something up and seeing it go down the road on the same tire as like a Toyota Camry. Now guys, we have the tire off. We still have it on the jack, but it's on jack stands. Even though it's on the jack, do not trust it. Don't stick your legs underneath this axle or anything. And if it fails, it's gonna come down on you. You don't want that to happen. Crush your leg, crush your hands, crush your kids, or maybe even that neighbor you don't like. So make sure you guys are safe doing this at home yourselves. But without further ado, guys, we're basically at the point where we're gonna start dropping this axle, disconnecting it from the stuff that we're gonna replace, and bolting in the new stuff. So here we go. Everything we do to the Jeep, we're basically gonna have to do to both sides. There's a couple of exceptions to that. I'll go over those, but at this point, I'm just gonna show you how to do it once on one side. You kind of know how to do it then on the other side. One thing you definitely should disconnect is this bracket off of your lower control arm. This bracket holds your brake line and your wheel sensor, and you don't wanna damage that. You don't even wanna risk it. 15 millimeter wrench. Spin that nut off. Make sure you put this nut in a safe place so you don't lose it. And this bracket comes right off. My trick is to always put the nut back on if you can. That way you don't wind up losing it. It's easier to keep track of. The next part of that bracket that we just disconnected is going to be this little 10 millimeter bolt over here. That brake line and wheel speed sensor runs through a bracket connected to your spring perch. We want to remove that as well. 10 millimeter on this one. You can spin that out, break it loose. They're not that tight, and just take it out. Now we're still on the passenger side, and next on the list is going to be to remove the bolt from your track bar, but on the frame. This bolt obviously is on the axle. We're going to leave that one alone, but this is your track bar. It attaches just inside your sway bar link on the passenger side. Follow that up to the driver's side, and it attaches to this bracket here that hangs down right behind your sway bar. Okay, this is a 21 millimeter. I'm gonna put a socket on that. I'm gonna put a wrench on the back side. You're gonna keep that nut and bolt because you're gonna need to use it when you reinstall it to a factory torque spec. Now, those are things that Rough Country did not mention. You're certainly gonna need a torque wrench to make sure when you tighten things like this, that it's tight. Your track bar is a super important part of your suspension, and you're gonna wanna make sure that it's done right. Next, we're gonna remove the bottom bolt of the shock on both sides. This is an 18 millimeter socket. To make it easier than using a typical wrench, I'm gonna use a crescent wrench with a ratcheting side for the nut on the other end. That'll allow me to loosen this up a lot faster and just make quicker work of it. Now sometimes, because there's pressure on that shock, these bolts don't just want to come out. So even though the nut's not on the back side, all you have to do is just keep cranking on it with your socket wrench and it'll just back itself out. Now we're just going to simply pull the shock out of there. Like we did before with everything else, we're going to slide our bolt through, put our nut on the back side. That way we don't really have to keep track of it, make it a little bit easier. While you're here with that 18 millimeter socket, you're going to want to disconnect your lower bolt on your sway bar link. This here is your sway bar link. This is your sway bar. By removing that, it'll allow us to droop the axle when the time comes. You don't need a wrench on the other side of this one. This has what's called a flag nut. This little piece here comes off the nut and it will actually rotate as you loosen it, and then it'll stop. It'll get to a point where it doesn't want to rotate any farther. Now I did wind up getting a second floor jack for the bottom of this just to make it a little bit easier. It's not completely necessary, but it made it a little bit easier, and I had one. At this point, I'm going to lower it down a little bit, stop and check to make sure I'm not pulling on any wires. So it's pretty far down. This wire is starting to get a little bit tight. What I think I'm going to wind up doing is taking this little clip out and this little clip out. That'll give me some more slack in this. But the idea here is that we're going to lower the axle until the axle's far enough down to where there's no tension on the spring and the spring is fully drooped. At that point, we can just basically slide it out. We are going to need it to drop farther though than enough to remove this, so we can put our spacer in there to reinstall it and give it that extra height. So I do think I'm going to have to wind up disconnecting that, but we're going to get that done. I simply used the needle nose pliers you saw at the beginning of the video and use those to pull out the little plastic clips that were holding the wire in place. All right, guys, I also did unplug the four-wheel drive actuator here to give it a little bit more room, not worth risking it. What you're gonna wanna do with this is between this bracket and this white tab, basically put a little flathead screwdriver in there, pry on it until this tab pops out a little bit. It's only gonna pop out that far, not far. And then once you're done with that, you're going to want to grab the plug, push down on that white tab and pull it straight off, and it just comes right off. With that done, we'll lower down the axle the rest of the way, take all the tension off those springs and remove them. The spring, slide it off to the side, kind of wiggle it out. You're also going to want to take this isolator down off the top. Now this spacer is going to go up top, basically slide up over your bump stop. That rubber ring that we removed before is going to go underneath this, and then we're going to put the spring back in. Do the same thing on both sides, start jacking it up, and those springs are reinstalled, and now your Jeep is going to be this much higher than it was factory. Next, you're going to want to install the bump stop spacer on both sides. That usually just slides right between the coils. You might have to pull on them a little bit, but slide it in there. Then you're going to use the supplied bolt from the package and drop it in the top, along with the nut from the package. That's going to slide underneath the spring perch, which you can access with a wrench and get it in. Next, you're going to want to replace the shocks on both sides. So using an 18mm wrench, you're going to be able to remove the bolt on the top. Then install that new Bilstein shock the same way you remove the old one. Use the jack to raise the axle just slightly to line up the lower shock mount with the hole in the shock. Guys, now that we have raised the suspension of this vehicle, we need a longer sway bar link to maintain the geometry of our sway bar. The tough part though is if you try to take the nut off the back side of this upper, the whole ball joint in there just spins. So you're gonna need a 6mm Allen key. That'll go in the end of the stud on the back side of this and stop the entire thing from turning while you're loosening the nut. Now you're going to basically take this bent sway bar link that comes supplied in the kit. You're going to install it. You're going to want it curved so that the top is curved toward the outside of the sway bar, and the bottom curves toward the tire of the Jeep. That way it'll basically fit, line itself up in there. At this point, you're going to use the supplied nuts and bolts. All right, guys, with everything plugged back in, we got our actuator, we got our 10mm bolt in, our bracket reattached, new shock installed, spacer, bump stop, new sway bar link. At this point, that's pretty much everything that the front of this vehicle needs in order to be 2.5 inches higher. We're going to move on with the rear. That's a lot simpler because we don't have steering and those kinds of things involved. It's also easier to access some things. But the one thing you're going to want to make sure you do is reattach that track bar. You can't forget about that. But the easiest way to do that is going to be to set it back on its tires, then actually have someone turn the steering wheel. It'll help align the track bar bracket in the factory hole. Again, get an alignment when you're done. But other than that, guys, that's pretty much it for the front. Onto the rear. So after chocking the front tires, jacking up the rear, and setting it on jack stands, it's time to remove the track bar bolt on the rear axle. This time it's going to be the axle bracket, not the bracket on the frame. You're going to remove that with a socket wrench just like you did on the front, and we're going to get started. Next, remove the lower shock bolts on both sides using the same 18mm socket and wrench that you used in the front. Then unbolt the sway bar link from that shock bracket. The rear is much simpler. We're not working around the steering or anything like that. Just after undoing a few of these things, we're ready to lower down the axle with the jack and wind up dropping out those springs. We're gonna drop on this bump stop spacer. The grade 8 hardware supplied in the kit. You're gonna get 4 of these, basically one on the front side, one on the rear side. Gonna drop that bolt in there. These are a 9/16 wrench. Just gonna make them finger tight for a second here until we get them in position. Then we're gonna tighten them up. Then just like we did on the front, an 18mm wrench on the upper part of that sway bar link, that 6mm Allen key in the end to stop the stud from spinning, and you're gonna replace those too. Now it's time to install the spacer that's gonna go above our coil spring. It actually goes like this. We're gonna use the supplied nut or bolt that came in the kit. It says right here to not exceed 35 pound-feet. Remember guys, when you tighten these in, there's really no force on these except for upward pressure, which is what we're trying to do anyway. This is a washer with a welded nut on it. We basically have to place it in there. You'll see me do it in just a second. Everything's gonna thread together and basically squeeze this into position. Using that washer with that nut on it that I just showed you, we're gonna slide it in above the upper spring perch between the body and the perch. It can be a little tight sometimes to get it in there, but you can work it into place. Then you'll lift up the spacer and install it using the supplied bolt. After that, hold the isolator in position and reinstall the spring. Do this on both sides. With all that stuff installed back here, bump stop, the spring spacer at the top, new shock, as well as the new sway bar link. Now keep in mind, you could have reused your factory shock and just installed the supplied spacer as we would have done for the front. Basically just raises that lower shock mounting point. But all we need to do now is basically put tires on it, put it back down on the ground, and then reinstall the factory track bar bracket. Do not forget that. It's super important, and you got to torque it to factory specs. On this case in the back, we're going to use the factory hardware. So guys, that's all there is to it. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. There's a lot more stuff like this and more complex stuff like that CJ coming. Guys, make sure you get out there, build something.